Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Community Development Society's webinar, Future Forward, Building an Adaptive Field. And welcome. And I just have a few announcements before the panel begins. First of all, if you're joining and you're not a member of CDS yet, we welcome you to join and learn more about our organization and the benefits and all the networking opportunities. You can take a look at our website, cdsociety.org. I will put it in the chat. And also, we're coming upon some very important deadlines. Our 2026 annual CDS conference will be in Savannah, Georgia, here in the USA in July, from July 19th to 22nd. If you are interested in attending and presenting, our call for proposals is currently open. The early acceptance deadline is actually tomorrow, and the final deadline is December 17th. So please visit our website to learn more information and how you can submit a proposal. We also have pre-conference workshop proposals and sponsor tracks. So there's a lot of information on our website at cdsociety.org. I'm going to pass it over to Madhavi Reddy, the Executive Director of Community Development Advocates of Detroit. Thank you for joining us and bringing this panel here to CDS.
Thank you, Tammy. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see where you're all joining us from. Thank you. We're going to try to keep the energy as high as we can for anyone tuning in at 6 a.m. your local time. So we're going to try to keep the energy high. As Tammy said, I'm Madhavi Reddy. I'm the Executive Director of CDAD, the Community Development Advocates of Detroit, joining you from Detroit. I'm also an Associate Professor of Practice at the University of Michigan in the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. So today, I'm going to start sharing my slides in a second, but just to make sure we're all in the right place, this is about thinking about the future of community development and building a more adaptive field. I'm joined by three, I think, of the best and brightest, some of the, there we go. I'm getting foiled by my actual picture in the way. Okay, joined by some of the best and brightest. I'm really happy to introduce the panel. Before I get to introductions, I just wanted to take you just very quickly what we'll be going through today. I'll do panel introductions. I'll do like a 1 or 2 minute framing, sort of the discussion and why we think it's really important to talk about this as a field. Frank will talk about some sector-wide scenario planning that his organization did, and that will do a little bit of sharing of 3 opportunities for action over the next 3 to 5 years. And Angela will talk a little bit about some work that she's currently working on that's really designed to build a more adaptable field. And then we'll take some questions. So please feel free to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat, share where you're coming from, and maybe ask questions. You can ask them in the chat, or I think you can come off mute when we get to that part, but I will investigate that during the presentation. All right, so today we are joined by Angela Carlberg, who's the Senior Director of Community Development Ecosystem Building at CDAD. Angela has 15 years of experience cultivating relationships in state government, academia, and community development sectors, where she specializes in facilitating conversations at the intersection of race, gender, policy, and organizational change. She has had positions with Ramsey County and the Democracy Collaborative and a number of other initiatives across the country. We're also joined by Maggie DeSantis, who's the principal of Community Development Strategies, LLC. Maggie is a native Detroiter who has worked in community development since the late 70s. She founded the Warren Connor Development Corporation, now known as the Eastside Community Network, one of Detroit's most prolific community development organizations. She then went on to launch a multi-stakeholder collaborative known as Building the Engine of Community Development in Detroit, designed to create a community development ecosystem for Detroit. And next we are joined by Frank Woodruff, who's the executive director of the Community Opportunity Alliance, formerly known as NACITA. Frank is a strategic leader dedicated to igniting extraordinary communities and improving lives. Frank became the executive director of Community Opportunity Alliance in 2012, where he's been confidently confronting challenges faced by low and moderate income communities. So I think we can do a little invisible virtual clap for our panel. Welcome and thank you, the three of you. I know I threw a little bit of a random ask to participate in this webinar with me, so I appreciate all of you very much. I think, we just want to start with acknowledging that the world is changing. It is always changing. And really trying to dig deep into how do we as a community development sector, no matter what part of the sector or ecosystem or movement, whatever we want to call it, no matter what part of the community development family we belong to, how do we need to change with it? And how do we meet this current moment? I realize that there are people joining us from all over the world. I think we'll be talking and alluding to a lot of what's happening in the United States, but also understand that there is, a lot happening all over the world. So just want to acknowledge that. So we wanted to start with a question: why do we need to reconsider our current approaches? I think, our current approaches assume economic growth. We often value power, speed, efficiency, productivity, things that are easy to count. And I think that they may be based on frameworks and assumptions that are not really true anymore. When we speak with young people that do our work, that work with us in community development, we're often reminded that they're facing a situation where they're not going to maybe do as well traditionally and economically as the generations before them. So there are some assumptions about growth and generational wealth and change that maybe aren't true anymore. And so we're confronted with concerns about whether our current systems and practices work for everyone. So we're thinking about current and future challenges. Maybe we can acknowledge that they're not going to be solved by the free market. I have free, in quotation marks, like we used to think that market-driven solutions would fix everything. So how do our current approaches consider future generations? And you think there's a lot of grappling with individualism versus collectivism. What are we working for in service of the collective good? And then we're managing multiple acute shocks. Again, it feels for many of us that this is a time in history where there's so many shocks and things happening, but just want to acknowledge that this is certainly not the first time in anyone's history where we've been managing really difficult things. But right now we're thinking about, still recovering from a pandemic, natural disasters and climate change, infrastructure failures, increasing polarization, systemic inequalities, and increasing austerity. So while we are grappling with those things, we are also trying to reconsider how we approach these issues. Many of them, have been around since, as long as people have been around. So quickly, I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm trying to get to the good stuff of our panel. There are generally 4 dimensions when we think about what society, community, and how we do our work, and that is of course people. There are organizations that do the work. We a lot of the times our work is in place. And that we're thinking about leadership, strategy, and knowledge. What do we need to know? So those are maybe some 4 dimensions for consideration as we try to build a more adaptive field. And the things that I think we've been talking about at the university and at CDAD in our work is thinking about how do we embrace emergence? How do we think more about regeneration and circular economics in terms of our economic development? What about the ideas of reciprocity and repair? What are some hyper-local strategies that we can use really at the, almost the block level while we also consider system-wide policy change? Thinking about the social solidarity economy, thinking about social infrastructure and social cohesion. How does our work in and with community really contribute to the social fabric of the places that we work in? Thinking about transdisciplinary and cross-sector collaborations. And finally, thinking a little bit about how the field of futurism also relates to our work in community development. So we're when we think about co-production, utopian visioning. I think there's a lot of thinking about the worst case scenario, foresight, and scenario planning. So that's just a very quick framing of our thinking around how we're gonna work together and the things we're gonna consider for trying to build a more adaptive field. I am going to now turn it over to Frank Woodruff from the Community Opportunity Alliance to talk about some some sector-wide scenario planning that Community Opportunity Alliance did. Frank, I'm going to work your slides, but I can't see you. I'm going to try my best to keep up with you, but if I'm not going fast enough, please let me know. But I'm going to
I'll
turn it
verb.
right over to you, Frank.
Thanks, Madhavi. Yeah, I'll verbalize for you. So, hi everyone. My name is Frank Woodruff. As Madhavi said, I'm executive director of the Community Opportunity Alliance. The Community Opportunity Alliance is a national organization based in the United States that we consider ourselves a field builder for nonprofit community development organizations in the United States. So, what we try to do for the field of community development in the United States is convene the sector, do research on trends in the state and production and leadership of community development organizations. We advocate at the federal level and occasionally at the state level for community development organizations. We have some capacity building programs and try to advance the identity of the field for those outside of it. If you go to the next slide, please. So in the United States, there are a little over 6,000 community development organizations. CDOs being defined as nonprofit organizations that are community-based, that have at least part of their work in mission-based real estate development. There is about $24 billion a year that go through these organizations, and they hold about $54 billion in assets. Assets, think affordable housing, lending portfolios, commercial real estate, community facilities, et cetera. The sector about every 3 years produces over 500,000 units of affordable housing, over 3,000 community and commercial facilities, and supports almost 400,000 small businesses. I think importantly to keep in mind, especially for this conversation, is that just about every organization, virtually all, 96%, do some sort of social service, broadly defined. The broadly defined as sort of like everything from housing counseling to workforce development, supportive services for the disabled, community advocacy and organizing. Virtually all organizations do something more than real estate development. So to cue up today's conversation, what we wanted to know at the Alliance is that the first couple of months of 2025 were quite turbulent for our field. It introduced a lot of uncertainty into what the future meant. And when I mean the future, I mean 3 months from now, let alone 5 years from now. And so what we wanted to do is help. We wanted to imagine ourselves in some ways in 2025 as if it were the summer of 2020. For those who were working in the field in the summer of 2020, it was a really disorienting time as well. So we tried to imagine ourselves now in 2025. What if we had tried to advance this conversation about what this moment is going to do to this field in the coming years? What if we tried to have this conversation in the summer of 2020? What are the types of things we would have wanted to know? What are the certain types of things we would want to predict and prepare for? And so, excuse me. So what we did is we came up with scenario planning. So what we tried to do is, find out what the current political environment will do to community development organizations 5 years from now, and how can we get ahead of that? And we came up with a couple different scenarios that we think are likely in the coming years. If you go to the next slide, please. First of all, we wanted to try and wrap our head around how vulnerable is this sector to dramatic changes at the federal level. And there's a little kind of equation here on the screen to how we kind of think about risk, vulnerability, and exposure. But the bottom line is that what we thought the most kind of likely adverse scenario for the field is that if certain federal programs went away that we thought were politically vulnerable, around 10 to 20% of the 6,000 organizations in the field would go away probably pretty quickly. Either cease to exist as an organization or be functionally incapable of losing staff, that kind of thing. So 10 to 20%. 2/3 of the field would feel the impacts pretty directly financially and would be impacted in some notable way. So we thought there's a relatively likely chance that there would be some pretty adverse effects on the field. And we wanted to try and predict, well, what would those adverse effects potentially be? And we came up with 3 scenarios that we are starting to engage the funding community on, our members in, and those who partner with the field, as to what we think the field might look like in the next 4 to 5 years. If you go to the next slide. And, given the way that the federal government supports community development in the United States, we think that one adverse scenario is that there could be a growing gap in between what we call the earners and the non-earners. Or in other words, in community development, this most frequently refers to those that do real estate development versus those who primarily provide social services. In other words, we are already seeing this. This is already happening already in 2025. The funding that has been cut off to community development organizations is largely social service based. So think school lunches, think food service programs, think workforce development programs, Medicaid cuts for social service, for supportive services and supportive housing developments. We are seeing less of that, at least so far, on the development side. But over the next 4 to 5 years, the gap between those 2 types of entities could continue to grow. And we as the field will have to react to that in some way. How is what we're starting to have the conversation on. The second scenario that could potentially take place is that the fundamental financial underpinnings of community development in the United States may cease to exist or function in a dramatically different way. And specifically what that means in the context of this is, like, for those who are familiar, the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA. Does CRA go away, or is no longer enforced, or is fundamentally changed in dramatic ways? Does the CDFI fund at the Department of the Treasury, the fund that supports community development financial institutions, does that fund go away, or is altered dramatically, or is not staffed going forward? If those types of tools were to go away, that the federal government supports and drives, let alone the variety of grant programs that support the field, we would have to really, really rethink how these organizations earn their money and serve their communities. And the last scenario that we thought was potentially likely is that there's going to be a movement within the field, somewhat maybe even driven by philanthropy, towards consolidation of the field, i.e., organizations merging, acquiring another, some just going away, and the need for collaboration and convening among organizations that remain. In this conversation so far is being driven largely by the funding community so far. We hear whispers. I mean, I'm not in the funding community, right? But we hear whispers and rumors and just kind of straight out statements like, have you thought about how many organizations may have to go away, and how do we continue to serve the communities without those organizations at all, or serve those communities with a different type of organization? So these are obviously not mutually exclusive scenarios, but it was really helpful to us to think about 5 years from now, this is how the field could be different. So what conversations do we need to start having today in order to be somewhat more prepared for what the field looks like in a couple of years? And one of the ways that we are having those conversations is by putting this on webinars like the one we are having here. So thank you to the Community Development Society for having us. If you go to the next slide, please. No, I should have shown this, but this is a little bit more of a description of what I just said, why we think that these scenarios are likely, and what the downstream impacts of these scenarios might be. And these will be in the slides that go out later. So I think going forward, we're going to have a little conversation, loosely oriented around these 3 scenarios. And so for my part, I'm just going to go a little bit deeper on what was scenario 2 on the financial innovation and hybrid capital. In the United States, the federal government funds in some meaningful way 90% of the CDOs, 90% of CDOs, a really, really high percentage, defined as at least $50,000 over a 3-year period. That's a lot of support from the federal government. However, for other nonprofit sectors, it's actually the field actually earns a relatively significant percentage of its revenue through earned revenue, through real estate development, lending interest, and similar. About 50% of the field's revenue comes from earned revenue. So while a lot of individual organizations do get federal money, a lot of organizations also generate a lot of their own revenue. And that mix has changed over the last 20 years. Organizations have become less and less dependent on the federal government in terms of overall dollars over the last 20 years. But if that were to change even more, what were the impacts of that might be? And so when we engaged in this conversation with a set of our funders last month to say, like, oh, if some of these tools were to go away, how would the funding community respond? These are some of the responses we got. There would be a move towards a general operating support, sharing more back office services, a need for more patient capital, potentially looking to other sectors to fund community development that have been smaller players in the past, like insurance companies, healthcare institutions, and the like. But I think the fundamental tension that underlies this whole scenario is that the tension that, at least within U.S. community development, has existed at least for 60 years. This tension between scale and accountability. Is the role of this sector to produce things at scale, produce them efficiently, produce them more effectively, to kind of bleed every dollar out of every stone, so to speak? Or is it the goal of this sector to remain accountable to the communities that they serve? In some ways, and sometimes when it's working really well, the answer to both of those questions is yes. There's not a right or wrong answer, but we do fear that the answer is much harder to come to consensus on in an environment like this one. Is the fear, and so that tension that is underlie this work been underneath this work for 60 years really comes to the forefront in moments like this. So with that, I'll go back to Madhavi. Thanks for giving me a chance to present our scenarios and our planning.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to turn it over to Maggie to talk about the next two scenarios. And Maggie, just like Frank, let me know when you're ready for me to move the slide.
Maggie, you're muted. If you want to unmute your audio, please.
All right. Thank you for having me. So ironically enough, the idea of mergers and collaborations, it really is it's cyclical. I'll just say that. So there have been times in the early days of community development when that was a much more acceptable way of operating. But as community development began to grow, it became clear that as valuable as the notion of an organization being embedded inside a community, connected to that community with lots of relationships, the nervousness about the high cost of administering each one of those becomes very clear. There is, I'm not going to lie, as a practitioner, it's very difficult to feel as if the funding community is pushing toward mergers and acquisitions, if you will, to decrease the number of organizations. What we would argue from the ground is that the beauty of community development, which is that very localized, close relationship with residents, very deep understanding of what's happening in any given community, that value must be preserved. So how do we preserve the value of a community development organization and how it relates to a community while also increasing efficiencies. And so we would argue that philanthropy can incentivize rather than pressure or push. They can incentivize creativity among community development organizations, whether it's organizations that share the same geography, whether it's organizations that provide similar services in an area, and really begin to think about the idea of shared services. Philanthropy can incentivize that work, which is not inexpensive, requires a lot of help, a lot of technical support, a lot of expertise, that they can incentivize sort of using a carrot approach and offer opportunities for community development organizations to just sit and explore initially. And there are many, many ways that we can get here besides mergers, if you will, which tends to be a very, very scary word among community development organizations working on the ground. I see the comment about the value of the work without philanthropic investment. And all I can say is, yes, I agree. The challenge, of course, becomes how the work is sustained, because it also cannot work. It cannot really have the kind of deep impact we want without professional paid staff, without different kinds of support to residents and local businesses who volunteer their time. So like it or not, philanthropy is with us, and it's important to see them as partners, even when their behavior would not necessarily indicate that they are acting in a partner capacity. Although more and more foundations, I believe, are really starting to understand that and starting to adopt that behavior, and even starting to hire people from the field to actually come to the other side of the table and begin to act appropriately as a funder. So there are many, many different ways that we think organizations can share services. In Detroit, one example is an entity called the Detroit Housing Network. It's really not a corporation, if you will. It's an organization of housing counseling, ground level community development organizations, and human service organizations who cover virtually the entire city, although each one of them is place-based. And how do they cover so much geography in the city? They do it through a shared data system, and they do it through an agreement to cross-refer residents. So, for example, a resident from the east side might come in order to prepare to purchase a house. But then in the process, what becomes clear is that there are also some serious issues, perhaps some mental health issues, perhaps some education issues. And so there's an ability to refer that person to other organizations for support. Obviously, privacy issues come into play, but there are ways technologically to protect the privacy of residents. So that's an example of organizations coming together and actually having a larger impact because they're sharing data and they're cross-referring. It took probably 1.5 to 2 years for the Detroit Housing Network to really stand up in regard to the data sharing, but it is still functioning. And in a city like Detroit that has lost so much population, where the poverty levels are so high that it's very, very tough for residents of less means to acquire, to own or rent housing. This kind of housing support is extremely important. There's obviously risks in a place-based organization, a nonprofit organization, where the board is very, very, not just philosophically, but emotionally tied to the organization. It's very tough to even consider this kind of work. And the organization itself might be nervous. It would require holding a mirror up and really taking a look at what kind of changes would have to be made. But these risks can be dealt with, and confronting the risks eyes wide open is worth the effort. Another example in Detroit is that there's a growing CLT movement. Many exciting and vibrant community land trusts are forming in many different neighborhoods. And there's now a question about whether the administrative apparatus needed to run several smaller CLTs could be modified, if you will, to think about some shared services so that the CLTs can put more resources into the work of acquiring and stewarding land and providing affordable housing. So we want to think of it more as unleashing resources that can be invested directly into the work on the ground. Next slide, Madhavi. Madhavi, do you want me to go into this now, or should we pause and just get some people's thoughts about mergers and shared services?
You know what? I cannot see the chat. So if there's an active chat and you want to ask people to come off mute, go. I think we're doing well on time. I was being a little strict earlier, but we are doing well on time. So if that feels right to you, Maggie, we can pause and ask people.
Okay.
Or you
So I
can
see.
share something that's in the chat.
Yeah, and that's what I'm about to do, Madhavi. Thanks. So I'm
Thank you.
looking at a comment, given the federal cutbacks that are impacting CDOs across the nation, how do you reach out to the philanthropic and business community in a more coordinated way? How do you avoid having CBOs tripping over each other and securing funds from foundations and or the private sector? Oh my goodness, isn't this the dilemma that all of us who do this work face? And Madhavi, I'm inclined to actually punt back to you to talk a little bit about the Funders Investment Forum that I know is happening in Detroit. In response to the question about reaching out to the philanthropic and business community. Can you take a minute and talk about that?
Yep, I'll also invite Angela to come off mute. I think that in Detroit, we are very lucky. I think we have a close-knit community development ecosystem. A lot of that is due to a little bit of work that you'll hear about. Maggie will talk a little bit about building the engine, but I think we have close relationships with our foundation partners, our partners in government. And so there's been a concerted effort to really fund community development in a different way. So we do have something called the Community Development Fund. It's a $28 million funders collaborative that has 7 funders investing in, don't quote me on the number, I think 38 community development organizations. And that CDAD, and this is Angela's work, convenes a group called the Community Development Investment Forum, which brings together all the various funding entities and some CDOs to really problem solve, to really be in a solutions oriented space about, what are we really going to do at this moment in time? So I don't know, Angela, if there's anything you want to add. I don't know that does your work on that work group justice, but go ahead if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, thank you. And hello, everyone. Angela Carlberg at CDAD. Madhavi is absolutely right. And I think that that's a great question around how do you keep CBOs, community development organizations in Detroit from tripping over one another. I think given the sheer number of philanthropic organizations. So there are 8 based in Detroit, I believe is the number, plus some with federal or national and international footprints. So we're really fortunate to be able to have that amount of resources. And what that also means is that there is an increased need to continue talking across or within each sector around what are our respective responsibilities that we have to one another and to the sector. Are we clear and transparent in what our funding priorities are and where we would like to see the work to go? And so a lot of this work that I'll be talking to in just a moment is around managing expectations, not just managing expectations and interventions, not just vertically from federal funds down to grassroots, but also across. And how do we manage accountability in that way? So I'll talk about a little bit of that in just a moment. But I think Maggie had a few more insights to add around collaborations and building the engine.
All right.
Maggie, do you want to take another question or comment from the chat, or shall we go on?
I think we've addressed them,
Okay.
what we see so far. You can go to the next slide, Madhavi.
Thank you.
Oops, actually, the slide with the collaboration. There we go. Thank you. So the building the engine of community development in Detroit process, and sorry for the name, but we were interested in creating a name for the initiative that actually said what it meant, so that no one would have to look at it and say, I'm not really sure what that is. So building the engine is a takeoff on Detroit, Motown, but other than that, it is what you see here. It was a temporary process that lasted for 5 years that was very specifically intended to create and build a more aligned community development ecosystem in Detroit. And ironically enough, we decided to begin by defining system elements, but we did not do that by first checking research or doing research. We did that by diving deep into the actual community development group of organizations themselves, residents, and then the professional community development organizations. And we asked them to begin to define what they saw as the system elements. And we then used the rest of the process to test our theory about what those elements were. And so we defined 7 system elements. We then broke each element down separately and created a very, very diverse and cross-sector group of task forces. Who each of them had a specific set of deliverables, an idea, a concept, a project that they had to come up with, research that backed up whatever their idea was. And then we spent time kind of putting the whole system back together again. So it was a highly facilitated process. It was very, very deliberately and intentionally a process of bringing together, I'll just say, unlikely bedfellows. So for those of you who do the work, you know that there are some inherent tensions among certain organizations. And the tendency is to avoid really talking openly with each other, really eyes wide open, facing each other's differences. We, on purpose, put those kind of task forces together. And each of them took one of the system elements. So, for example, you'll hear a little later from Angela about one of the system elements, which is creating education and career pathways for community development. So that task force researched any other career pathways that were present around the country, discovered that there weren't really any dedicated to community development. So we kind of had to borrow elements from that research and then put our own set of skills, education, and experience that would be required, a competency framework. We then put together a concept that really split the leadership pipeline idea into a youth section and an adult section. And Angela will tell you more about that. But the point was that in the room where that task force was working, we had everyone from residents to community development organizations to universities to research intermediaries. In this case, the Corporation for a Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. We had the city of Detroit. We had foundations in the room, and we went into it. We dealt with issues of racism and bias and the kind of assumptions that we make. We took a look at how universities can tend to, if you will, make community development more esoteric than practitioners on the ground might find useful. We took a look at how you train people to have the values needed in community development, whether that's even possible. So there were a number of different issues that came up. And so that group came up with a couple projects that Angela will tell you about. That's just one example of how we dug into each system element. We learned a lot over this 3 or 4 year period. And I would say that there are several key factors that we learned, and that helped us move to a point of being able to hand off 5 specific projects, primarily to CDAD, but a couple to other organizations. So what were some of the key factors? First of all, we spent enormous amounts of time thinking about facilitation strategies for each meeting, what we wanted out of each meeting, and what kind of relationships we needed to foster outside of each meeting. We, again, I referred to the concept of unlikely bedfellows. We intentionally seated people at the task force table that were unlikely partners. So you see the examples that we have here, and that was done intentionally. There were co-chairs for each task force, each from a different sector. We used a number of methods of learning in order to inform the process of designing this ecosystem. So we commissioned a local university to look at community development ecosystems across several cities in the country and to send back their recommendations. We spent a great deal of time traveling to 5 cities and talking with residents in community development organizations and talking to our own residents. And so the combination of the academic research, our own observations, and listening hard to the lived experience of folks on the ground in Detroit informed the process. We formed, and this was a quiet part of it, we formed what we called a Coalition of the Willing. This was a small group of individuals spread across the different task forces who showed us in a number of ways that they were deeply committed to the process and really wanted to get the results that we envisioned. And we just quietly spoke to each other regularly about what kind of resistance was coming up, how we could promote the importance of the process, how each one of the convenings should go. And that Coalition of the Willing really was tremendously helpful in getting us through some definite tension that arose throughout the process. And then we regularly brought everyone together. So there was a lot of separate work going on, but through regular forums and through an annual summit, we would bring the separate task forces back together again. Recommendations would be shared. A lot of time for interaction among the participants. Even at the annual summits, we would deliberately seat people near each other, again, unlikely bedfellows, so that they would have to, work with each other, have to speak with each other, have to share views. And while there were some tense moments at those summits, we paid attention to good facilitation practice and made sure that, that the meeting norms were clarified. And we occasionally would have to enforce those norms when it got tense. So those are the key lessons that we learned. I would say today, that work is embedded primarily in CDAD, as well as Data-Driven Detroit, as well as with one community development organization working in partnership with 3 others. So the work carries on. There's a system committee at CDAD that kind of watches out for how building the engine work is happening. And we try to work in service to this notion that a community development ecosystem is important if the work of community development is going to go forward and have real impact in the city. So I would say that that's probably a best example. I feel a little bit nervous about saying that, partly because I managed the whole process, and so I'd like to think that it went well, but partly because you just never know, how long these kind of collaborations will last. It did inspire the creation of the Funders Collaborative that Madhavi referred to, and the creation of the Investors Forum that Angela referred to. Hopefully those will continue, but it was an important piece of work. It was an important set of collaborations, and the work goes on. So I would argue that that kind of deliberative process, constructed in a certain way, with certain outcomes that were expected, really has had an impact on community development world in Detroit, and it's infinitely replicable. None of this is rocket science. All of it can be done, I would argue, anywhere in the world, depending on the local dynamics, and making sure that people who understand those dynamics are managing and facilitating the process. Any
Yeah, I was going to
questions?
say thanks, Maggie. Is there anything in the chat that you want to lift up before I turn it over to Angela?
Well, you see here in the chat, thanks, Madhavi, the 7 system elements. So for what it's worth, and these might be different in any given locale, but the first one was system governance and coordination. And in the case of building the engine, CDAD was invited and accepted the invitation to kind of hold the product of this ecosystem building process. System capitalization is, as you can imagine, it's a never-ending process, but a task force went to work really digging into what we mean by system capitalization. We joked a lot that system capitalization is about money, but not just money. And I'm guessing that all of you understand what we're talking about. It's really about how you coordinate resources. It's about how resources are leveraged. It's about whether public and private funding is working together. And it's about creativity and funding. I would also say that this goes to one of the questions in the chat, that we preach a lot about the notion of a scarcity mentality versus a mentality of abundance. Because as you know, competition for funding can be toxic. And so we talked a lot about how building an ecosystem had to be about growing the pie and not figuring out a different way how to slice the existing pie. So that task force did a great deal of work. They produced a report called Roadmap to Equity that is worth your reading. I'm sure Angela will send you the link to that document. Capacity building and certification is all about trying to coordinate the kind of technical assistance and support that community development organizations need, and to provide enough of it. So CDAD helped create and now organizes a one-stop shop, if you will, for organizations to get the kind of support they need, instead of that support being defined by funders or government and then kind of parachuted into the community development organization. Education and career pathways, this was key. We want to build a bench, especially a bench of young people who can continue to do the work. But our dedication was that the pathway be filled with Detroiters of color, who, again, were not brought in from the outside, but grew up in the city, understand the city, and love the city. Neighborhood voice and advocacy is about multi-sector tables that CDAD now coordinates in neighborhoods in order to really understand what's happening in the neighborhood and for residents to find solutions. And then data and evaluation element was really about finding the right kind of measures for what makes a neighborhood great. So for example, the academic research we commissioned, we asked this university to take a look at the norm of social cohesion and whether that was meaningful in the world of community development across the country. The study that came back basically suggested that the most important indicator of a strong neighborhood is social cohesion. However, it's not the only factor that makes a neighborhood strong. So it's necessary but insufficient is the way we think about it. From that premise, a concept of neighborhood vitality was developed, again, from the ground up by one task force. And there's now an annual perception survey and then secondary research that is kind of blended together in order to create a profile for several zones within our city council wards or districts, if you will. And then the last element is city engagement. And this is really a growing relationship with our city government, working in partnership with community development organizations. I will say that this one is currently less clear, although CDAD right now is doing a great job of putting together a transition playbook for a new mayor who's going to be starting as mayor in January, our first woman mayor in our entire history. So I think the concept of partnerships between city and community development is, I'll just say it's a work in progress.
All right, thanks, Maggie. I'm gonna move us along and turn it over to Angela so we can leave some room for questions. Go ahead, Angela. Let me know when you're ready for me to move your slides.
Great, thank you. So I won't belabor this slide, but as both Maggie and Madhavi mentioned, that the work started really big and broad and had us really conceptualize what does this work mean for Detroit? What can we learn from other places? And how can really hone in on some of that work. So with those system elements, Maggie mentioned that there were a number of projects that were born out of this work. And so I think what I want to highlight here is, in addition to us thinking about what is required of us in the future, how can we be anticipatory, and how can we work with one another across difference, and the social cohesion, is that we also, one of the missing things that has come out of our conversations, especially with the system building committee, is as we are working and on alignment and principles for alignment and frames for alignment and a shared language, some of that is not losing sight of the harm that's been done to Detroiters of color. That includes Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color. So to not lose sight of that, and that we continue to talk about the kind of repair that is needed, and what is that level of disinvestment, and how do we quantify that, and how do we arrange ourselves so that we are able to see a picture that is bigger than any one project, despite it being part of a larger process, right? So in framing that comment, wanting to say that we were able to really drill in and down with the neighborhood vitality index that is community informed. It's a community input process on key measures and indicators that folks wanted to see, and that go beyond the poverty indicators and the despair indicators that we are traditionally quantify in neighborhoods where we are trying to do service and do work, right? And so some of the neighborhood vitality index focus was to come from a place of abundance, and how do we capitalize on resident perceptions, especially if they're positive in nature, and what do we need to do to debunk in the interim if there are some misnomers. So I just wanted to flag that continues to be a project that We, again, are working with our philanthropic partners to continue to reiterate to them that, this process is necessary and it's appreciated. And as we continue to generate enthusiasm and incitement, that also increases our abilities and the capacity of the Vitality Index in particular to be leveraged even further than what it is. So now we have not only these key measures that have been informed by the broader community, but that also will tie into other processes such as, mapping and its relationship to the already existing CDOs or block clubs and so on. So we're really looking forward to the potential that this project has and product has. I also want to know, as I said, we are digging into these individual projects, is that we're also trying to think even broader. For one, Detroit is a city that was built for 1.5 million, and there are less than 700,000 people here in the city. So you can imagine, just like finite or discrete projects might happen in any one neighborhood, we need to start thinking about that alignment piece, which is sort of what we talked about in the collaboration that both Frank and Maggie added. And so with the System Building Committee, with efforts like our Regional Housing Partnership, we are seeing a need for focusing on, just the individual neighborhoods, but what are some key components that will allow for greater efficiency. So a good example, not included in this slide, is with our Rebuilding Home Together. It's a home repair project, and one of the statistics that has just recently come out is that I think just about 50% of Detroit housing is substandard. And so you have an aging housing stock and the need for repair to counter the need for disinvestment, just to bring it up to livable conditions, not even talking about energy efficiencies. Like the cost of home repair can range anywhere between 4 billion and 20 billion is the number that is circulating in our work with the Center for Community Progress. So to have that perspective and to know, yes, we can have these individual projects. There's also some very critical systems interventions and core components that we need to be thinking about beyond just convening. So next slide. So one of those things is the Community Ownership Learning Table is a collaborative. It started as some work with the Kresge Foundation and the Chicago Fed, who actually is a partner, started with the NBI in the Building the Engine process and has since sort of moved her way throughout philanthropy and now is at the Chicago Fed. So between her efforts and the philanthropic efforts, they wanted to make sure that we are building a shared language and understanding, and that we're exploring some key models and structures for shared governance and mechanisms that would allow for us to develop and or preserve the land, but to also then shift our framing from home ownership to land stewardship, right? And so how can we co-create community-driven learning environments that cultivate the power in ownership models, but then they're also reparative, so that we do still have that mindset that says the need goes beyond just building for the future and anticipating the future, that we have some gaps that we need to fill and to make up for those who are already here. So topics include community land trusts, but we also, as Maggie mentioned, got like really deep into, yes, community land trust, yes, this is amazing. Yes, we're going to have a community land trust ordinance, and money is starting to filter into that. And again, just because of the sheer size, the sheer space, and the need for diverse housing, diverse, safe, healthy, affordable, accessible housing, that land trusts are but one way for us to do this work, and that we want to make sure that we are exploring other ways for sustainability and to help bridge some gaps in equity and accessibility when it comes to just home ownership. So we are exploring those alternatives and continuing to bring folks from our CDO partners, philanthropy to the table, and some intermediaries as well as some CDFI partners who they're continuing to learn what's going on locally, but also nationally with some of our, and actually internationally as well, that could be offered here in Detroit. So that's the learning table. Next slide, please. The next piece of work, as Maggie and Madhavi mentioned, is our community development leadership pipeline. And this is really a pipeline that supports youth through our sunset years, specifically focused on Detroiters. For the last 20 years, we have seen brain drain and folks leaving be due to the lack or perception of the lack of opportunities here in the city. And so, one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is to engender some learnings that folks who might be interested in coming back or would like to return, but also like how can we cultivate a shared sense of understanding, commitment, and pride, and want and willingness to work at a very young age. So our pipeline, you can see a mock-up at the bottom, just pay no mind and trying to read, but essentially we have broken it out into focusing on primarily for 3 to 4 areas that includes youth, some early career, mid-career, and late career. It also includes what we can call a dignity framework or an org change framework that allows us to focus on the livable wages, benefits, retirement, and a place that we all want to show up to work. A lot of times we talk about nonprofit being no profit, and so how dare we encourage youth to come up and through community development without providing them the kinds of supports and ability to live and pay for the things that they like. And so the pipeline itself, and I see a question around, is there an assumption that the wider system won't serve the community in these ways? I would say that maybe it's not a wider system so much as a coordinated system. So some of the things that we are doing is that there's a community development curriculum with some that was taught with the Coalition of the Willing. There were 4 community development organizations who raised their hand and said, yes, absolutely. Let's go into the schools, introduce youth to this work in key language, meet the organizations, and so on. In the last couple of years, we have invited other folks into this process, teaching the curriculum that's been developed and co-designed at our respective organizations with bringing on other facilitators within those organizations to do said work. And some of the facilitators have actually, at these organizations, have actually gone through the youth curriculum and taken on paid internships or mentorships. We also have a dual enrollment where kids, high schoolers, will be able to get college credit for working at the community development. So for the youth and the mid-career, those are our paid internships and mentorships. But really, again, really wanting to emphasize the commitment and the distinction that we have here in Detroit. Detroit is different, and we love it. And also, we want to make sure that the youth understand, and this is something that we want to be in and we want to stay in. Mid-career, we want to make sure that folks are able to either come into the system or move throughout in our neighboring or partnering sectors, if you will. And so we want to make sure that in addition to the shared language and understanding, that there are some transferable skills that they can have that will make them successful in and outside of the sector. So some really great examples from CDAD. From CDAD is that, we have staff who have moved on. One's moved on to the city, another's run for mayor, I believe, or city council, mayor, both. We have another one who moved to philanthropy. And so using CDAD, for example, as a case study for what it means to come in as youth. And one was an AmeriCorps member who now has, after 7 years, now works for a city council. And yeah, so really great examples of a case study here. And then I guess finally, what I wanted to add is, there's that late career and, how do we encourage that succession planning and board development and the kinds of torch passing that we could imagine as necessary to really bring folks up into the sector, positioning them to lead when our senior leaders decide that it is time to maybe turn it over. So that is the pipeline and some of the infrastructure that we are working through imagining. And then I guess the last slide, I believe, is really just to uplift that, the future of community development connects that social cohesion and those reparative frameworks to help build that shared identity and address structural harm. So we're doing both, and that builds trust and repair and solidarity and resource redistribution, collective voice and accountability. So thank you for listening.
All right, y'all, we made it. Sorry, Maggie. I was going to stop sharing.
There was one topic that we did not address, human service versus real estate.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I was so excited by our revisiting of building the engine that I skipped right over the slide. Go ahead, Maggie. And then I think I can stop share and then maybe take some questions.
Okay. Well, so one of the things that we thought would be important in thinking about the future, for those of you that have a history of doing community development work, you will know that in the 60s and 70s, there were a number of mega community development organizations around the country. They were huge. They offered a multiplicity of different programs ranging from affordable housing to commercial development, social services, childcare, workforce development, et cetera. And then over the years, the funding preferences, again, steered the work more toward unit production. How many housing units can you produce? How much commercial square footage can you build? I find it ironic that I think we've come full circle. I'm seeing a trend where there is a recognition that community development is really about the intersectionality of the physical development with the human development. And depending on where you might slot organizing and advocacy, that component as well. So I think community development organizations are doing a much better job today of kind of recognizing that communities are complicated. Residents live that complication every day, and therefore community development has to reflect that complicated, that intersectionality. So a person who can't get affordable housing, a child is also going to be unable to assure that their children are getting the best education. A worker who is having health problems and can't get access to good health care is not going to be able to rise above the poverty line. Environmental hazards affect entire neighborhoods. And without organizing and advocacy on certain issues, neighborhoods can be left extraordinarily vulnerable, especially neighborhoods that aren't properly buffered between where the residents live and where the industry is located. So I think what I see is that more and more community development organizations are doing a better job of integrating it. So whereas in the 60s and 70s, you might have had a huge CDO with multiple different departments, if you will. What we're seeing now is community development organizations that are providing spaces and places where a lot of this different work happens in one place. and the staff and the organization are structured so that they're, internally you get more and more cross referrals. You get more and more of the same residents being able to move through the organization's services. There are two examples in Detroit, and I'm sure there are examples elsewhere. One is called Brilliant Detroit, where a nonprofit specializing in early childhood goes into neighborhoods, finds the neighborhood organizations and the CDOs. They identify a house that needs rehab. They rehabilitate the house, and then they pour services into the house with professional social workers and counselors. And then the house itself is managed by neighbors from that neighborhood. That's an example of kind of blending that, the physical development with the human development. Another example in Detroit, we see more and more of our wellness hubs where the organization, either at its own headquarters or in other spaces, provides opportunities for a number of different services to residents, recognizing what you might call the social determinants of health or the different dimensions of wellness, if you will, that those terms are often used interchangeably. So there might be one place where everything from technology training to physical wellness checkups to fitness to arts and culture classes are all offered in the same room, and mixed in with all that are opportunities for the residents to come together, to have fun, to play games, to come to forums, voter forums when there are candidates running, et cetera. So I think going forward, I think the more we recognize that intersectionality and understand that so many different factors influence the life of a resident, the life of a child, and therefore the life of a community, the better we will be as community developers.
All right, thank you, Maggie. I'm gonna stop the share. I thought I saw someone's hand raised, not mine. I didn't mean to do that.
Madhavi, we have Laura Gale's hand up, and I put in
Please.
the chat for anybody that has a question, just click the raise hand feature and we will get to you so you could ask a question. So do you want me to have Laura be able to
Yes,
talk?
please.
Okay.
Hi. Well, thank you, first of all, for this presentation. Especially, it sounds like it was done, pretty like you all stepped forward and put it together quickly. So thank you for that. And I wanted to ask if there are CDOs that you work closely with, like that you feel like you have really good synergies with in other parts of the country.
I think would start by saying that I don't know that they're close working relationships, but the CDO fund that we were referencing is managed by enterprise community partners. So there's been several city to city exchanges where we've built relationships with folks in Baltimore, New Orleans, Atlanta. We just got back from Oakland, trying to just build more relationships between CDO. So I think that if you asked me this question next year, I hope to be able to list off a number of organizations. But Frank, I wonder if you have anything, since your national organization, your members are wonderful. Are there any orgs across the country, some of your members that you're working in close partnership with?
I would say, yeah, as Madhavi said, our membership at the let me take a half step back. A couple times when you were during today's presentation, that came to mind that I think I like to advance as part of these broader field level conversations is that we got to be honest with ourselves. Community development is a pretty fractured field relative to other parts of the nonprofit sector. In some ways, there's pluses and minuses to that. Fracture tends to have a negative connotation, but there can be pluses and minuses to that. really key to the human development pipeline conversation that Angela was advancing, and the resource sharing conversation that Maggie was advancing, is to keep in mind is that intermediaries of variety of types are really, really important in a fractured field like this. And in the US, like that, like enterprise and LISC tend to be like the known as the big intermediaries. But there's other types of intermediaries too, not to mention organizations like CDAD, right? The Community Development Advocates of Detroit. There are approximately 40 organizations like CDAD that are within our membership. I think we have most of them within our membership. I don't think there are a ton more in the United States that play a really, really important role beyond the finances. The finances are important, and CDAD does do some of the finances, but there are other pieces of this that are really important, like relationship building, like connecting to other cities that may be somewhat like Detroit, or at least Detroit can learn from, and vice versa. And so the role of intermediaries is really, really, really important in our field because it is so fractured. I guess what the part of the problem, I would say, not problem, but challenge that a city like Detroit has when it comes to learning from other regions is the philanthropic presence that Detroit has. Other cities in the US just don't have that. And short of like a New York maybe or something, but it's just but New York is just so much bigger and has its own whole thing going on. But every city has a dynamic like that. Either they have a lot of philanthropy, or they have the really unique kind of formed local government, or this really charismatic mayor that's been there for a generation, or whatever it is. Everyone has their own kind of dynamics, but it makes Detroit learning from others hard because Detroit has something really important. Not everything, but they have a really strong philanthropic presence that other cities just don't have.
Thank you. That's really instructive. I appreciate it.
Thank
I
you.
might, Madhavi, if you don't mind, if I could just add to that a little bit. I think it is true that Detroit has an abundance of large foundations that are, international ones with a home base there, or more local ones. The upside is that there's a bigger presence that we can try to tap into. The downside, though, is the tendency for the foundation community to forget that its best role is the learnings that they can gather and share, and their best role is to incentivize, not control. So there is a downside, and I would never I don't want that to mean that we don't want all these foundations here, but you do, as the comment stated earlier, you do have to remember as a community developer that the work is about community development. It's not about what the funders want, and that tension has to be managed respectfully. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Lori has their hand up.
Before we go to Lori, there's a
Sorry,
question.
Angela.
If Frank could, there's a question in the chat. If Frank could expand on what he means by fractured.
Mm-hmm. By the nature, what I say is a couple different things. At the national level, national organizations like ours, there are, depending on how you count them, 50 to 100 national organizations that take some sort of slice of the 6,000 local organizations that I mentioned. So, for example, if you're familiar with the field, there's NeighborWorks, right? And there's about 300 NeighborWorks affiliates. There are Enterprise is a great example. Like, they're an intermediary, but they're not in every city. They're concentrated in some areas and not others. LISC similarly. Then there are the issue-based organizations that focus just on housing, right? They're about the organizations that do housing, or just on the organizations that just do small business, or sometimes they're racial ethnically based. The Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Developers, or Latinos, or similar. And there has not, up until we at the Alliance took a kind of field building approach a couple of years ago, just as recently as 3 years ago, there wasn't anyone kind of looking at the field as a whole, right, as opposed to their slice of it. And so that's one thing I refer to when I say it's fractured. Another is that there's an almost infinite number of funding sources or infinite is overstating it, but there are a lot of funding sources that come into the field. There's not exactly one or a very small number of federal programs that fund the whole field. there's a lot of different. There's a low-income housing tax credit, which isn't even really funding technically; it's tax credit, and there's housing programs, there's small business programs, and so there's a lot of different funding sources just from government. And then you get in that's before you get into private philanthropy, major foundations, banks play a big role. And so the funding comes from a lot of different directions too. And then of course there's the fact that these organizations by definition are place-based, right? So and that's why it's hard for the folks on this call to say like, oh, is there a CDO in Detroit that really works with a CDO in another city? Like, well, not really, because that's not really the mission, right? The mission is the place. And so that's another dynamic at play. So that's hopefully gets at the question.
Thank you, Frank. Hi, Lori. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so my name's Lori Cook. I'm a PhD candidate in educational studies looking at lifelong learning in the context of community development. And what I've kind of zeroed in on as a gap is a need for more reflexivity. So not reflection, but reflexivity in the profession, in the field. And I'm just curious, a lot of what you were talking about sounded to me very much a reflexive kind of process. And I just wanted to ask the panelists if they could comment on the role and potential need for more reflexivity. And I'm differentiating this from reflection. And if I'm hoping everybody understands what that means. But and then how that connects with the processes you've been talking about today.
I'm going to be honest, I'm Googling reflexivity.
So this is anyone else before I
yeah, please define what you're offering for in terms of reflexivity, and then I'll chime in.
So that's that in and of itself is actually very interesting, because I've noticed in the literature there's a lot of, and even in practice, there's a lot of back and forth use of reflection and reflexivity interchangeably without people necessarily understanding the difference. So just briefly, reflection is usually looking back at something, like I did a workshop and I want to make sure, I want to look at the evaluations and see what I could do better or different going forward. Reflexivity is more about critical theory and critical thinking in the sense of, okay, what's going on in this moment? What are the power structures that are involved? What are the assets that we could leverage? What are the, it's much more in the moment now based process. And I would say it can be a self-reflexive process. And then it seems to me that there's also the opportunity for group reflexivity, which what you've been describing feels more like a group reflexivity, group-based kind of process is what you've been going through. So I'm just, I was just curious if you think that is more the case.
Thank you for defining, and I would say maybe unintentionally, yes, that's at least from my vantage point, and a lot of like my perspective is very much rooted in what is reparative and what is liberatory, and how do we move forward from that. But I think that there are also really good examples of what gets lost from if we don't have a closed feedback loop. So like a lot of times we think about storytelling, and especially in the repair space, we want to talk about harm and like capturing the stories and what does this mean for Detroiters and their legacies, and they've experienced these things, and it's good to have that information, but what do we do with it? And so in our community engagement processes, we continue to advocate, like, how are we reporting back? Where are folks seeing themselves in some of this work? Like, how do we admit or not? I would love if more folks, especially institutions, especially the philanthropic philanthropy would be able to say, this is the impact that we've had. over the years, and it's not enough to admit the complicitness in perpetuating systemic racism or harms done to people, but to actually be able to say in the moment, in the process of righting past wrongs, how are we making those changes? So yes, I think we're trying to, I think when we're asking for transparency within the sector or across the sector, that some of that is, just help me understand your why and your thought process for how these decisions are coming to fruition, especially in our relationships with philanthropy when, asking about their funding decisions. And with the CDO fund or with some of our other pooled funds, we said, oh, this is a really great idea to have philanthropy come together, drop all of this money into a pool, and then it be flexible for organizations to tap into. And this is the response to COVID. And so they're going to have a proper amount of overhead. They could just, do with it what they will. But the response was, or in that uptake was, we're going to stand up programs, we're going to hire new staff, we're going to, build out our own, place-based initiatives that might not necessarily align with individual funder priorities. And so one of the things that we, realized in the last couple of years is that these programs and processes have been adopted by these place-based organizations, but it's harder to get funding to continue on in that way because it came from a resource that is not necessarily continued to be not a resource. Again, if funders aren't putting in, then they're funding individual things. So I definitely call for greater reflexivity and a greater level of explicitness when we are talking about that. So, but thank you for that,
Lori, for the question. Thank you, Angela, for your response. We have about 4 minutes left. I dare not try to ask another or take another question. I just wanted to offer the panelists anything else you want to add you didn't get to cover. We have 4 minutes for our closeout. Or Tammy, if there's anything that you have left to cover.
I'll jump in. I think Lori's question was a great one. I would agree. Once I looked up reflexive, and I think I know what you means. I would agree that there's not the space for that nearly as much as there should be and needs to be. I think I put a document in the chat that we created about 7 years ago or so that we continually use to have those types of conversations, what we kind of describe as the fundamental tensions within the field that change from year to year. So just as an example, I mentioned earlier, this tension between scale and accountability, or another way to think of it that people talk about, are we an industry or are we a movement?
Yeah.
And the answer to that question changes based on who you ask. But even if you ask the same person, if you ask me, it would change on a year-to-year basis. For example, in the summer of 2020, we were never more of a movement, and we were never more driven to be accountable to the communities that we serve in this field. In my 15 years in the field. That moment, I did not realize 10 years prior to that how much we were driven towards production and towards scale and towards deliverables in the field, and how far and how quickly the field swung in the summer of 2020 towards one towards the other. So I would agree that it doesn't happen nearly as much as it should and needs to.
I'll jump in there, Madhavi. So two things. So Laura, the reflexivity was kind of our instinctive way to begin the building the engine process. It was all pointed forward. Where the tension came in, frankly, was when people from different allied sectors, if you will, or cross sectors, begin to react to old baggage, past baggage, even past learnings. And that's where the facilitation became important. The second thing I would say, in the question of are we a movement or an industry, my answer has always been we are both. It is not one or the other. And that is the beauty of community development. It's also what makes it so daggone complicated, difficult, and challenging. And that's how I would end. Yes, we're both.
Thank you, Maggie.
If I could have one more thing.
25 seconds.
or 25 seconds. I will say that as an executive director who's been doing this for 15 years, I every day balance the money, the mission, and the moment. And not one time, not once, in all the funders we've had in 15 years, has a funder asked me how reflexive I've been this year. Not once.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been so informative. Thank you to the attendees and many thanks to all the panelists. Madhavi, Frank, Maggie, Angela, thank you so much for giving of your time to join us today. And also special thanks to Tanner Knorr. He's the chair of the Webinar
Tanner.
Educational Training Subcommittee. Many thanks for helping to put this together. And we hope you'll join us for a future webinar. Also, I set a reminder in the beginning, please go to our site, CDSociety.org. We have some deadlines coming up for the call for proposals for the 2026 CDS conference. So please check that out. And if you're interested, please submit a proposal and join us in 2026. Thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Tammy.